Hello and welcome back to this series taking a look at the tank losses and their use patterns during the Russo-Ukrainian War. This is the second episode and is for April 2022. In order to analyze these loss patterns, there will be two main metrics that I will be using. That is the base hull, which is easy enough, T-80s, T-64s, that kind of thing, and a system that I refer to as the modernization level, which is a rough way to show changes over time without having to specifically graph out every specific model, which is just too much detail and too much clutter. Instead, I have categorized everything into 5 levels, from -2 to +2. Our -2 tanks, these are your early Cold War eras, your T-54-55s, your unmodernized T-62s. You could also think of these as the truly obsolete. These tanks do not have the kinds of modern sensors or ammunition to be able to perform anywhere close to more modern tanks. They also will do things like lack a protection system that would at all be sufficient to even survive fairly light anti-tank weapons in the modern era. The -1 category are your mid-Cold War era tanks, things like the T-64 and the T-72, in their either base models or their early models. And these are tanks that are still quite widely used around the world by proper militaries. So, we're not talking insurgencies or rebel groups, actual governments, although not necessarily governments that can afford particularly much for modernization. Your level zeros are what I would consider to be more the global standard. These are tanks that are absolutely respectable. They have some of the more modern features, more modern ammunition, and do have armor packages that would require dedicated anti-tank assets. However, they will usually not have things like thermals, and their ERA will, for the most part, be contact 1 or similar. Your level 1s are usually going to be significant upgrades to these same tank models. These will be things like the T-72B3 and the T-80 BVM. Usually they will have quite modern systems, such as better ERA packages, NAUJ, Relict, and that sort, as well as they may have thermals. Now, unfortunately, I cannot just use those effectively as checkboxes that will automatically put you into level 1, because I don't think I could include something like a Leopard 1A5, despite the fact it does have thermals, in the same category. The final category is level 2, and this, unless something significantly changes, will only ever contain the T-90M. The reason for that is I believe the T-90M, as being the most modern tank that Russia produces, and is actually in production with new hulls, it should be tracked separately. These categories are not strictly a ranking of which tank is better, but again, a more general idea of how modernized it is. There will be some friction and disagreement over those that are, for example, barely into the level 1 as to whether or not it should actually be a level 0, and vice versa. But again, it's very general. But to get into the actual data, according to Lost Armor, we have 45 Ukrainian losses during the April period. These are 5 T-80s, 7 T-72s, and 33 T-64s. If we compare this to the previous months, knowing that, well, because February was only a couple of days and its data is going to be the most vulnerable to artificially late date attributions, we sort of have to ignore February. And the only real conclusions you can draw comparing the March to April data is perhaps an increased usage, and thus loss, of T-80s, and this could indicate the higher use of Ukraine's air assault formations, which, at the start of the war, were the ones with the T-80s. Although, we certainly can't say that for certain. Taking a look at those Ukrainian T-80s, all 5 of them are BVs. This does mean that, well, all of them are going to be level 0s, And the reason the T80BV is level 0 is because it allows the T80BVM to be level 1, as I think is only fair due to the significant modernization that that tank represents. The Ukrainian T-72s contain 3 AMTs, 1 AV, 1 B1, and 2 Bs. The T-72B1 is new. We haven't had any show up in the loss figures before, so a little bit about it. The T-72B1 is a T-72B that doesn't have the ability to fire ATGMs, and the only visual difference on this is in this sight. Specifically, the sight on top with its slightly smaller size than the one in the bottom image, and those 4 circles in the corners. That is the sight on a B1. Yes, the tank that this is mounted on is a T-72AV, but the important thing is the sight itself. Overall, this is one of the most annoying things to look for, because you have to be able to see this sight fairly well in order to tell it apart. If we take a look at Ukraine's T-72 modernization statuses, we see that most of the force is made up of level 1s, which are going to mostly be the AMTs, because they have NOJ and some models have thermal sights, and the level 0s, which are going to be some kind of T-72B. What we do see here is that between March and April, there is a significant drop-off in the proportion of those level -1s. Now, that could be a result of the -1s having been destroyed. It could be a result of Ukraine not throwing its reserves in as much, or it could be a result of the worse-equipped formations simply having rotated off the line as things somewhat settled down, at least compared to March. As for which of those it is, we can't tell from the data. That's just too much detail. Looking at Ukraine's T-64 losses, there is 1 B, 28 BVs, and 4 BV Model 2017s. The T-64B is simply the BV without ERA on it. It's got the ATGM sight, which is how you distinguish it from a B1. Overall, these are going to be pretty uncommon. Looking at the modernization statuses, we see that most of the fleet is made up of level 0s. This is mostly all of those BVs, but there's a small number of the BMs, which are level 1, again, NOJ, some models have thermals. But if we look at those, we do see that they were present in March, and there weren't any identified as having been lost in April. Once again, this could be depletion, rotation, or simply those units just not being on so active a part of the front line. If we don't see any real use of that category for, say, 6 months, then we may be able to start to consider that it may genuinely have been depletion. But we will have to, of course, wait for those 6 videos in order to figure it out. The overall modernization status for the Ukrainian tank fleet is, at the start of the war, most formations, about 75%, were equipped with level 0s, so that's decently equipped. We do see some use, about 20% of it, was modern tanks. There does show a significant drop-off, and again, that could be rotation or several other potential reasons, and a small number do seem to have been equipped with fairly outdated tanks. Taking a look at Russia's losses, of the 147 tanks identified by war spotting during this time period, there are 2 T-90s, 30 T-80s, 111 T-72s, and 4 T-64s. If we take a look at how those compare March and April, again, having to kind of ignore February, we see that the breakdown is very similar, with the majority of the force being made up of T-72s, with a strong minority of T-80s, and pretty small showings from the T-90s and the T-64s. Speaking of those T-90s, both were T-90As, which of course means in March and April, all of them are level 1s. Looking at the T-80 fleet, there are 10 BVs, 8 BVMs, 11 T-80Us, and 1 UE-1. Taking a look at their modernization status, we see that the pretty strong majority of them at the start were level 1s. This is BVMs or Us, and pretty much the rest of them here are level 0s in the form of the BVs. There is a drop-off between March and April, but again, it is too soon to say with any particular confidence as to why that is. Should we continue to see this pattern over the course of the following months, then we can start talking about depletion. But right now, we can't. The Russian T-72s, as per usual, are the most varied lot, there being 8 unknowns, 1 Ural, 7 As, 2 AVs, 35 Bs, 11 B Model 1989s, 29 B3s, 15 B3 Model 2016s, and 3 BAs. The T-72 Ural is a new one, and this is it's the original T-72 model. Visually, it looks quite similar to the T-72A, although obviously there's no ERA, there's no ERA mounts, which is one of the more useful identifiers, and they will also lack smoke launchers. The IR searchlight is usually on the right side of the turret, but it can be on the left. But seeing as it will only ever have T-72 wheels, it cannot be that easily confused for, say, a T-64, so long as, well, you can find a wheel. The overall modernization status for Russia's T-72s are a little less modern than their T-80s. They still have quite a bit, in fact, a majority are level 1s, these being B3s, BAs, that kind of stuff, with a good number of level 0s, your Bs, and some in the -1 category, these being your As and your Urals. We don't particularly see any change between March and April, although we could be seeing a fairly minor drop-off in those modern tanks. Russia's T-64s are quite easy. They're all BVs, which means they're all level 0s. Looking at the overall modernization status for the Russians, again using lost tanks as an indicator of the composition of the tank fleet, we see that 65% were modern tanks, and may be showing a slow drop, but that could be depletion or rotation. It's again a bit early to say. They still have pretty significant numbers. About 30% were equipped with decent tanks, and there was a small number that had outdated models. These were most likely to have been concentrated in DPR and LPR units. In summary, when the war began, Russia's tank fleet was not only more modern, it was noticeably more modern than its Ukrainian opponents. And by April, both sides' tank fleets may already be showing signs of depletion, at least of their most modern components. Ukraine's rate of depletion does seem that it was higher at the time, but we will have to see what patterns emerge in future episodes, and as we get more data points. But one thing that we do know is that the attritional stresses imposed on these tank fleets by full-scale war will force composition changes, as both sides undergo the process of modernizations, reactivations, upgrades, as well as, in Ukraine's case, the arrival of heavy equipment from Western nations. I hope you'll stick around in the future and see what patterns emerge, and I hope to see you all again next time. Bye-bye.